Okay, so I'm going to pick up where I left off, which is in the middle of the second lecture. I have a few more slides here and then move on to the third one. So just to situate everyone, remember we were talking about a variation on the trust dynamics model that I presented on Tuesday, where we're now allowing agents to form opinions over multiple different domains. So they're presented with more than one decision problem. They're trying to solve them all. The problems are uncorrelated with one another. But the agents use the other agents' beliefs in both domains to determine how much they're going to trust evidence on either of the problems produced by other agents. And so I'm looking at the distance between me and Kalen, say, in a two-dimensional, and we also look at higher dimensional spaces, but in the first instance, in a two-dimensional space, and using that to evaluate how much I'm going to trust her evidence. Remember, it's evidence that is being trusted. I'm updating on the evidence. I'm just updating using the Jeffrey conditionalization rule rather than Bayes' rule. I'm not picking and choosing what evidence to update on based on whether the evidence agrees with my current opinion or not. I'm only using the distance in belief and then updating on all of the evidence that I get just in this differential way. Okay, so we're looking at the two-belief model now. We're going to look at three different treatments in total in the paper. One is a case where agents are prepolarized in one belief, and then they're trying to solve a new problem. And so the idea here is there are sort of battle lines have already been drawn on one topic. And now there's a new question that arises. You're trying to learn about some new issue. And we're asking, if I use not only the other agents' distance on this new thing, but also my distance to them on the old thing, how is that going to affect how beliefs form? The second one is that agents just co-evolve credences about both beliefs. They aren't initially polarized. We just randomly seed credences across these two domains and then just see what happens. And then finally, we consider the case where you have more beliefs, right? And so we look at three. In principle, you could look at more. Although one of the things I'm going to point out is a way in which more beliefs kind of complicates things. Okay, so in fact, the results are pretty similar across these three treatments. I mentioned them because we describe all of them or discuss all of them in the paper. They're all kind of interesting things to consider. In fact, though, we're going to just focus on this one, mostly in interest of time. But I think these are the sorts of things that people often ask. Oh, have you thought about such and such? And the answer is yes. We have thought about such and such. And you get basically the same answer as what I'm going to describe. So I'm going to focus on the second one where they just all co-evolve. Okay, so what happens? Well, first, once again, increasing M, right? Remember, M is the strength of distrust parameter. It's the multiplier of the distance function in our basically loss function for trust in other agents' evidence. As M increases, what we find is that polarization also increases. Now, polarization here is defined as polarization in both beliefs, using the same technical definition of polarization that I gave previously, right? So because we're using the simplified belief model here, what polarization means is that agents that think arm B is better do so with very high credence. Those who think arm A is better do it with credence below whatever cutoff determined by M makes it such that they aren't listening to the other agents any longer. And so this particular graph is for a no anti-updating scenario. In this multi-belief framework, we also look at the anti-updating case. But this is with no anti-updating. So what you see is that as M increases, first, polarization increases. There's this other thing that can happen, which is that polarization in one belief will increase, but then it tends to decrease, and polarization in both beliefs increases more. So what we're seeing here is an instance of the phenomenon that we were trying to describe, right? Remember, what we were interested in was how is it dynamically that you can get these situations where people come to be polarized in two different domains, but in a correlated way, where they tend to cluster in their beliefs into two different clusters, even though the domains are unrelated. What's going on here is you can get polarization in one belief or polarization in two, but as M goes up, polarization in one belief decreases, and it becomes much more likely that you're going to be polarized in both beliefs. Okay. We can actually ask the question about correlation in more detail. I mentioned before that we're using Neiman-Pearson correlation functions here. Notice that for low values of M, when we end up in a polarized outcome, we have extremely high correlation. It's almost 1 for M around 1. Now, remember, we're using as a baseline just a simulated result where we don't have this trust dynamics, just to see what would happen if we weren't doing that. What's the sort of the base rate of correlation just due to random effects in beliefs. Basically what we're doing is we're running this with the trust dynamics turned on, but only for one belief. Only for each belief separately. So they aren't looking across the two beliefs. They're only looking at one belief, and we're just asking how much correlation do you get due to random chance under those scenarios. Now, notice that correlation is high for low M, but as M goes up, it remains above the baseline, but it becomes lower. And so why is that happening? That might look strange. And the reason, this is something that we didn't really expect when we started doing this work, but it turns out that the geometry of the situation explains that. Depending on how high M is, you end up in scenarios where agents that are attracted to each of the corners of belief space all start ignoring one another. When M is low, close to 1, these don't ignore each other, these don't ignore each other, these don't ignore each other, and these don't ignore each other, but these do. As M gets higher, these start ignoring these start ignoring these. Right? And so you end up with 4 groups, all of whom are ignoring one another. And so basically you need to have small enough M that there are other groups to apply pressure to, not so high M that you can break up the space too much in order to get sort of the qualitative effects that we were looking for. Now, I think it's fair to say that this is still a factionalized outcome. It's a factionalized outcome in the sense that you now have 4 factions, none of whom are updating on one another. They're basically just listening to members of their own group. The problem is that when you try to look at the statistics of this, what you end up with is just agents with all 4 possible combinatorial, or all 4 combinatorial possibilities, and the correlation coefficient becomes less informative about what's going on. What's definitely not happening, though, is that you are not evolving to consensus. You're evolving to an even more radically polarized situation. Let me mention one other thing. Here, M equals 1. In the previous polarization model, the one where we just have one domain and we're just deciding between 2 arms, at M equals 1, agents are still paying attention to one another. That's sort of the turning point at which the agents at some point start ignoring each other. In this model, just because the distance between here and here is greater than 1, right? It's the square root of 2. M equals 1 is such that there are going to be sort of regions of belief space that are ignoring each other. Now, the important thing for this result is that at m equals 1, these still pay attention to each other, and these still pay attention to each other. It's just these do not, and that's why you end up with 2 highly correlated collections of beliefs. Okay. This dynamics has other kind of bad effects on group accuracy. So as m increases, just like in the single domain case, what we see is the average percentage of true beliefs in the community tends to decrease. Now, if you look very carefully, there's actually a little bump here for m approaching 1. The average number of true beliefs in the community actually increases relative to m equals 0. Anyone want to venture a guess as to why that happens? It's a small effect, but it's robust. Kaylin, raise your hand. Maybe I'll pause while people are thinking about that and ask a question back to you. Did I understand from the previous talk that you have to wear a swim cap to go into the pool? Was that like the implicit? Okay, so you can't go in the pool without a swim cap. It's not just preference that people like wearing swim caps. Okay, but not on like a single episode, right? I mean, is that actually the reason? This is like this Bangalore hard water balding issue, or is it, okay, that's just like other regions making fun of Bangalore. Okay. Like, are you directed that you have to? Yes. Okay. There's like a sign. All right. Okay. Okay. Let's go back to this then. Okay. So what's going on here is that for m increasing but below 1, the trust dynamics is slowing learning. Now remember, we're doing this all on a complete network. And you can think of it as a dynamical network in the sense that the edges are getting greater or lesser weight depending on distance and belief space. But in principle, everyone can listen to everyone else. Now remember, in the base model, we had this trade-off between speed and accuracy, where less connected networks tended to slow down learning, but they increased accuracy. And the reason was they allowed more data to be collected before this Bayesian lock-in occurred. The same thing is happening here, just with a different mechanism to slow down learning. For m below 1, agents are all listening to one another, but they're updating more weakly on one another, so they're learning more slowly. And so there's sort of a longer period of transient diversity of belief, and in particular, transient diversity of action, allowing the agents to converge to better beliefs. But then once m becomes large enough that agents stop listening to one another, that effect quickly reverses, and you end up, for large values of m, with fewer than half of the beliefs being accurate. In fact, agents are wrong more often than they're right in this model for large m, which is bad. That's like a bad group learning outcome. Okay, so some takeaways from this. What we find is that correlation between completely unrelated beliefs can emerge endogenously when actors ground trust in holding similar beliefs with one another. It's important that this is happening in a model where there's simply no ideology, there's no group identity, there's no outside explanatory force. There's nothing that's making them correlate in this way. It's just happening endogenously because of who they're paying attention to, and they sort of capture each other and then tend to diverge. But they do so in a correlated way. Okay, so we take this as a kind of how possible model, how you could get factionalization to occur with agents actually paying attention to evidence, unlike in the Axelrod model, but also not having any kind of ideological explanation. Nonetheless, there are limitations here. So one limitation of these models is that the agents are in very good epistemic situations. In a sense, they're kind of ideal agents who adopt a, we argue, reasonable based on what scientists actually do, the reasons the scientists do it, but ultimately, given their actual situation, pretty bad heuristic. In fact, all of the agents are trying to learn the truth. None of them are biased. They're all collecting reliable evidence and they're sharing it. And agents are making what turns out to be a spurious distinction between good agents and bad agents, effectively reversing the benefits of the social, the benefits of social learning. And so this gives a sense in which even ideal agents can polarize, ideal except for the fact that they've adopted this bad heuristic. But what the model doesn't capture is the idea that in the real world, there's another thing happening, which is that many of the agents that we're encountering aren't ideal. Their evidence isn't reliable. They may even be biased or intentionally trying to mislead you. Under those circumstances, it may be good to disconnect or distrust. Right? And so what we're showing here is, well, under these ideal circumstances, ignoring some evidence or updating more weakly on some evidence can lead to factionalization, but it also leads to bad epistemic outcomes. You might say, well, hold on, if the agents weren't ideal, if some of these agents were actually just producing bad or unreliable evidence, then I would want to handle that differently. And that's, of course, the situation we think in the real world where scientists are making these differential judgments, that actually some scientists are producing better evidence than others. Okay. Okay, so this suggests that one would really like to look at a broader collection of models and think about other ways in which you might come to distrust agents and think about the other ways in which agents might be sub-ideal. Other agents in the network might be sub-ideal. There are different ways in which you could do this. I'll just point to one model by Bennett Holman and Justin Bruner, Kalen's collaborator, who's been mentioned a few times. They consider actors in a very similar kind of epistemic network model where some of the agents share biased data. The idea is that they're attempting to sway the population in one direction or another. So their motivation for looking at this kind of model is thinking about research done by the pharmaceutical industry, trying to persuade people that particular medications are safe and effective, even though independent researchers are concluding that they're not. And the idea is that you might have scenarios where industry-funded researchers continue to produce results of a certain sort that weigh against the total body of evidence with them excluded. And so under those circumstances, at some point you would like to be able to identify, no, there's something wrong with this research, we should exclude it. They show that in that kind of model, agents ultimately do better epistemically if they basically subject other agents' evidence to more stringent statistical tests. And so when you discount data where the results are highly unlikely, given your current beliefs, the whole population does somewhat better. Now, I think this is a really subtle issue, right? So you still get a kind of polarization where the biased agents end up believing one thing and other agents end up believing a different thing. But more importantly, Supratim asked on Tuesday, isn't this an instance of confirmation bias? And I said, no, we're not doing confirmation bias, because you aren't looking at the data itself. You're looking at the other agents, and you're updating on everything. Here, it is a kind of confirmation bias, in the sense that you're evaluating the data itself, by the lights of your own beliefs. And if you don't update on data that you think is incompatible with your current beliefs, you're going to end up in a situation where you might be the one who's biased, and you become immune to exactly the kind of data that would convince you otherwise. Now, of course, in this model, the stuff that ends up being unlikely from the point of view of the majority of the agents is intended to model the biased case. But you can certainly imagine situations where that's reversed, or where agents using this kind of heuristic are going to end up doing quite a bit worse or polarized for bad reasons. In this case, they're able to identify the biased agents because built into the model is the assumption that some agents are biased, and you're trying to figure out who they are, and you're doing it by doing your own work and then looking at the distribution of other agents' results. And what you find is this agent is consistently producing out of sample, or like out of distribution results, right? So you sort of keep track of each agent's results over time, and you basically assign a p-value to that. What's the probability of having gotten this string of results given my current beliefs? And as your beliefs update, you become more confident. They're, I believe, using the more sophisticated belief model here. So they're getting sort of smaller variance as time goes on. They become more confident. They also become more confident that that other agent is producing increasingly unlikely results. This is a much higher rationality model than what we were talking about earlier. And I think reasonably accurate in the sense of how, as scientists, you would try to identify bad actors. I mean, this is, in fact, how often we do identify fraud, right? Like, if a particular group is producing stuff that looks really unlikely from the point of view of what everyone else is doing, or just has really bad statistical properties generally, that's often a signal that something's going wrong in their research. It's just, there's this trade-off or risk associated with judging based on the data itself. Okay. Good. So just to summarize, mistrust of evidence can lead to polarization, even among scientific agents, agents who are updating in light of evidence, doing it in a reasonable and way. When agents use multiple beliefs to determine trust, this can create endogenous epistemic factions. Mistrust decreases the epistemic success of communities. And this one's a bit more subtle, but arguably, in cases where it's necessary, it's better to make these judgments based on the statistical grounds and careful analysis of the evidence that you're excluding, rather than heuristics about who's producing it. Okay, that's the end of my talk on Tuesday. Any questions before I move on to today's talk?
The first point in your summary, does that depend on specific network topologies and all
that? No, I mean, we're looking at, in some sense, we're looking at complete networks only. In some sense, because those would be the hardest ones to get polarization in. If you sort of prune the network, then you're still going to get polarization. It's just, you know, if you're again, if you're thinking of it as a dynamic network model, all you're doing is sort of artificially making some connections especially low weight, right? Just sort of setting those to zero. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so think about this figure for low m, so where these listen to these, and these listen to these, and these listen to these, and these listen to these. In that case, I mean, so these corners here are the corners where, or I guess actually, I'm doing this wrong. Let me take that back. Okay, so I'm not doing it wrong. These agents and these agents agree on one thing and disagree on another. These agree on the other thing with these ones and disagree on the first one. And so for low enough m, where these agents both listen to this one, it's just a kind of stochastic effect. They're listening to evidence from here, and they're listening to evidence from here. Over time, they're going to sort of get pulled up a little, pulled over a little, pulled up a little, pulled over a little, and they're going to end up in a kind of basin of attraction, which will just be that line, right? So they'll either end up going over there, or they'll end up going over there. When m is too large, and these agents aren't listening to either of these anymore, then they just stay here. Yeah, that's right. So as dimension increases, what ends up doing all of the work is just the value of m and what the distances end up being in that space. And so it'll always be that there are some corners that are closer to one another than others, right? So if you imagine a cube, you'll have the edges. Oops, sorry. You'll have, I just hit you with a laser. You'll have, the edges on each face, you'll have the diagonals on the face, and then you'll have the diagonals that go through the center. And those will all just be different distances from one another. And so for different values of m, you'll have scenarios where agents that lie on edges will listen to each other, but ones on any diagonal won't. You'll have agents that are on any face will listen to each other, but ones that are sort of diametrically opposed will not. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. In the last slide, towards the end, they should, yeah. In case where it is necessary, it is best done on statistical grounds. Does this imply that given what I believe, how likely is it that this new belief is true? Or is it given my network's beliefs, how often does this new belief show up, and then should I change my belief or not?
No, it's just evaluating evidence. So you're, the way to think about it is just you have a subjective probability distribution associated with each of the possible outcomes that you're updating with more evidence. Your variance in what the distribution over possible probabilities for this each of these arms is getting narrower and narrower. And so you're evaluating each agent's results, and you're basically asking, are their results, so you can think of that distribution, your subjective credence, as reflecting your aggregated sense of all of the evidence that you've accumulated to date. And so now you're asking for each individual agent, to what extent is the agent, is the evidence that that agent is producing consistently unlikely as compared to all of the rest of the data that I'm seeing. And so you can think of that as just assigning a p-value to a string of results from a binomial distribution, given your increasingly confident credences about what the probability associated with that binomial distribution is.
So something like, given that evidence 2 till evidence n is true, what is the probability that evidence 1 is trustworthy?
No. So think about it this way. All that's going on is that everyone in the room is flipping a coin.
Yes.
And I'm trying to figure out how likely it is that it's going to land heads. And when I look at everyone else, you know, they're getting heads sometimes, they're getting tails sometimes, but you know, on average, they're getting tails half the time and heads half the time. Except you, Kartiki, you only get heads. And at some point, as everyone else is doing this, I begin to think there's something wrong with that coin, or there's something wrong with what you're doing. And so what happens in the model is that once the probability of your results becomes sufficiently low, I just stop listening to you. I just ignore you altogether. They don't use this trust dynamics. This model predates the one that I described. And so they're just cutting off the connection. And so if you think about this in a real world kind of case, what you're doing is you're sort of reading papers in some domain. You're saying, okay, these people found this, and these people found this, and these people found this. And you know, these people have consistently found something that no one else is seeing. And other people are trying to reproduce it and whatever, and they're consistently finding it and no one else can do it. At some point you say, no, the probability of them actually getting the results that they're claiming, given what everyone else in the community is seeing, sufficiently low that I'm going to assume they aren't actually getting those results, that something else is going on, and I'm going to stop paying attention to them.
Right. So I do assume that everyone else is true.
Yes, right. And so this is sort of the risk here, right? You know, depending on the actual distribution of biased and unbiased agents, high quality and low quality agents, and so on in the community, this strategy could end up looking much more like, I mean, the way that I've just presented it, it looks like you know, careful and sober application of statistical methods to identify problems in a meta review. But there's another version of it that just, as I said, just looks like confirmation bias, where you say, well, this is what I've come to believe, and I see that, you know, this person and this person and this person and this person are producing evidence that I don't like, and so I'm going to ignore them.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, the general theory of relativity, though, like, I mean, what actually happens there is the evidence, they've got the evidence already. They know about the advance of the perihelion of Mercury. They've been looking for Vulcan for 40 years. And now we have a new theoretical explanation that seems to reproduce everything we already knew and also can explain this new thing. I think that's kind of a disanalogous case. I mean, the analogy, I think, would be the case where, you know, in social psychology, where someone discovers some new effect that no one was expecting. There's much less theory, it's all sort of data-driven. But actually, in that kind of case, I mean, I think that comparison is invited by this talk of p-values, right? So I'm saying if the p-value becomes sufficiently low, you should be skeptical. Whereas normally what people say is a low p-value is a sign of statistical significance, that there's been a real discovery, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you just have to I think it's just a very subtle thing. You have to be very careful in how you're thinking about this. The fact is that the most unexpected results also tend to be the ones that don't replicate. If we have good reason to think that something isn't real, even if it has other, you know, its author presents it as having other good statistical properties, you might still want to be skeptical of it. A Bayesian typically would be. A Bayesian would say, well, my priors of this are so low that even though you produce strong evidence, I'm still not going to be convinced. But yeah, there's a trade-off there, right? I mean, like, but I think the way of thinking about it is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in particular, evidence that can be reproduced across multiple agents. And what's going on here is you're identifying an individual agent who's consistently claiming the revolution, and no one else can reproduce it. Okay, I'm going to move on to the other lecture because there's not a fourth lecture for me to use to finish the third lecture. Okay. All right, so the final lecture is on conformity. And I'm going to begin not by describing a story, but by telling you about a very famous experiment that was conducted in 1951 by a social psychologist named Solomon Asch. So the Asch experiment involved the following setup. You had a group of people gather in a room in order to be experimented on. Okay, now it turns out one of them is an experimental subject. That person knows that they're part of an experimental study. They've been invited in. They've gotten a little bit of information, not full information. This is psychology, and so they're able to lie. But they have some information about why they're there. And they believe that the other agents around are also there for the experiment, that all of these agents are other subjects. In fact, though, is only one subject, and everyone else in the room is a confederate of the experimenter, right? They're paid to be there, and they've been given instructions about how to behave. The group is then presented with a task. The task is to say, of these 3 lines, which one is the same length as this one? All right, good. Good. Okay, so they're given those instructions, and then they go around one at a time, right? And the first person says B. The second person says B. The third person says B. The fourth person says B, and so on. And then typically towards the end, maybe the last or the next to last is the experimental subject, and they're then asked. And what Asch found was that even though B is clearly much, much longer than this line, and C is the right answer, contra trolls in the audience, that the subject, a substantial fraction of the time, not all the time, on the order of between 30 and 40% of the time, but a substantial fraction of the time, the subject would also say B. They would say the same thing that everyone else said. And so, unlike many results in social psychology, this one has been reproduced many, many times in many different experimental setups. Asch himself conducted experiments on this over the course of the next decade, but many other people have looked at it. And what seems to be the case is that under certain circumstances, humans have a strong preference to conform even when it means sort of defying the evidence of their senses, violating other kinds of commitments that they have, or doing things that under other circumstances, if they were just alone, they wouldn't do. Okay. So social conformity is just a fact of human psychology. People prefer to do the same thing that others do, even when they don't know why, or they disagree. And in fact, some authors have argued that this is as it should be, that it's rational to conform, at least in some circumstances. In other cases, it might turn out to be individually rational, but turns out to be bad at a group level. So why would it ever be rational to conform? Let me give you an example from my own life of just a few days ago. I already told Sagar this story. So after I got here to ICTS on Sunday night, I was at the cafeteria. We were having dinner. I noticed that not everyone, but a significant number of people before, like they picked up their plates, and before getting any food, they would wipe down the plate with a napkin. I was like, okay, I see that some people are doing that, other people aren't. Then I noticed it again at breakfast, and then at lunch, and then at dinner. And finally I asked, I was like, is there a reason that people are doing this? I'll admit that at dinner I did it myself. I had no idea why people were doing it. I just thought, well, if everyone else is doing it, I better do it too. And there are lots of reasons why it could have been, right? It seems like actually, I don't know that there is a reason. I mean, maybe there was just like a little bit of water on their plate or whatever. Like, I don't think that it was an actual scenario where there was some deep underlying explanation. But there could have been, right? It could have been something like, it could just be a cultural practice, but it could be something like, the way dishwashers work in this particular place, like you want to make sure that you get the water off or something like that before you eat off of it. I don't know. But you can imagine other kinds of scenarios, right? Where you're in a crowded train station and everybody starts running. You don't want to sit around and be like, well, I wonder why they're doing that. You want to get out of there, right? Something is happening, presumably. Okay, and so the idea is that there's scenarios where other agents may have information that you don't have, and that there are advantages to you to behave the way that they do, even though it's not what you otherwise would do or you don't know why you're doing it, because you recognize that they're likely acting in their own best interest, and it's given your other salient similarities, it would be beneficial to you to act in the same way. Now, there's a very famous example called an information cascade of a case where you can actually set up a scenario where it is individually rational for every agent in a sequence to perform a certain action. But because each of them are doing this in a sequence, you end up having a disastrous effect at the group level. And so you can make this kind of idea precise that actually even when it's individually rational to conform, because you're inferring information from other agents' behavior, things can go quite badly. And I think that you can see that happening in some of the other kinds of examples that I mentioned. But we're not going to talk anymore about the rationality of conformity. What we're going to do is ask, how would conformity, just this sort of empirical fact about human psychology, affect the dynamics in these epistemic networks? Now, in the previous talk, we said we're interested in polarization. There seems to be something related, some relationship between trust and polarization. Can we get polarization by incorporating trust? That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is saying, look, there's just this observed phenomenon of conformity. Let's see what happens if we include that in this kind of model. And what we're going to find is that we once again get polarization, albeit under different kinds of circumstances. Network effects are going to be much, much more important here. The explanation of polarization is going to be quite different, and in some ways more complicated. And then, assuming there's some time, I'm going to ask what we can learn from the situation, because ultimately what we're going to show is that we have two models that use quite different mechanisms within the same framework, and both provide sufficient conditions for polarization. And so from a modeling point of view, having multiple very different models, right? Like often what we want to see is models that make somewhat different assumptions, but are sort of postulating the same underlying kind of mechanism and dynamics to get some phenomenon, and then we say, okay, well, we have robustness in our models. It's really that mechanism that's doing it. In this case, we have kind of an anti-robustness in the sense that we seem to have lots of different models that can explain the same phenomenon, apparently equally well. And so what are we supposed to make of that? Okay. All right. So once again, we're going to work in the network epistemology framework. We're going to use this sophisticated belief representation this time with the beta functions, or I'm sorry, the beta distributions. We're going to introduce a preference to conform one's actions to one's neighbors. The way that we're going to do this is by altering the expected value calculation that each agent does when deciding which action to perform. Now remember, the general scenario here is you're trying to make a choice between two options. You have a credence about which one is better. You choose the one that you believe is going to maximize your expected value in the next round. Previously, the way we did that was just by saying the payoff, if you're successful, is 1. You multiply that by the probability of success by your lights, That gives you an expected value. You're just comparing the two expected values and choosing the one that's higher. Here, we're doing the same thing, except our expected value calculation includes one term, right? Remember, this is just the expected value of the beta distribution for arm X. It could be arm A or arm B. Okay? That plus another term. That term is a function of the number of your neighbors that performed one of the actions on the previous round minus the number that performed the other action in the previous round, multiplied by some new parameter k that's going to measure how much you like to conform. So k can be very small. If it's 0, of course, we just get the old model back. It could be very small. It could be that you just have a weak preference for conformity. Or it could be large, in which case this term is just going to dominate this one. All that's going to matter is whether or not, which action more of your neighbors performed. Okay, so in each round, you have your credence. You do this calculation based on your credence and your neighbor's behavior in previous rounds. You choose which of the two arms has a higher expectation. You perform that action. All of your neighbors do the same thing. They perform their action. You all update just like in the base model. And so you're still rationally updating. The only thing that's changing is what actions are getting performed. You respond to evidence in just the same way. You just make different choices. Right? And so you can think about this as an analogy to me with my plate, where I'm going to respond to Sagar explaining, like, no, you just do whatever you want with your napkins, like, right? Like, I'm going to listen to the evidence. I'm not going to change anything about how I process evidence, but I am going to perhaps change my behavior, at least temporarily, in light of what I'm observing other people doing in this preference to conform. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the expected benefit that individuals perceive of doing some action X, right? But there would be some real benefit that they received later on.
No, but here, you should think about it in the following way. I have preferences. There are things that I like. I like whatever this one-arm bandit or two-arm bandit pays off, but I also get a subjective pleasure from conforming. Right? Maybe it's I feel anxious if I'm the only one doing something or if I'm in a minority. Right? And so the idea is that the actual benefit I'm getting reflects a combination of two factors. The benefit I get from successful action and the benefit that I get from successful conforming.
So could it be where I could update this K that I have for myself based on whether conforming got me the correct answer or not?
You could if what you care about is just getting the correct answer.
Right.
But if what you care about is conforming,
right,
then that's just a reflection of you.
So I care about conforming as long as it keeps my benefit high. The second, but conforming actually doesn't get me the right answer, I want to reduce my tendency to conform and be informed by what I know as evidence only.
Yeah, so, right, so I think there are kind of two different ways of thinking about what's going on in these conformity cases, right? So I argued that conformity may be rational, but I also pointed out that it appears to just be a built-in part of human psychology. Right? And so you can say, like, why would humans ever have that built-in part of their psychology? And the idea is that, I mean, it's kind of like a thinking fast, thinking slow kind of thing. There are conditions under which it's rational, and so we end up being kind of hardwired to do it as our instinctive response to things. What I'm saying, what we're doing here in this model, though, isn't a kind of instrumental reasoning where the agents are choosing to conform because they think conforming is going to be a shortcut to a different kind of benefit. What we're building into this model is the idea that agents just like to conform.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So with this alteration, once again, there are new possibilities. It's still the case that simulations can approach either a true consensus or a false consensus, where all of the agents believe that A is better and perform A, or all of them believe B is better and perform B. But you also get other kinds of situations. One kind of situation you can get is one where the network converges to a uniform action. Everyone performs action A, or everyone performs action B, even though there isn't belief consensus. Some agents think the consensus is wrong, but because only one action is being performed, they don't end up getting convinced, and they don't produce any evidence to convince anyone else. So their beliefs end up being kind of stable here. They're polarized in belief space, but in action space, they're all performing the same action. You can also end up in a situation where you have polarization in action and belief, or even scenarios where you have polarization in action, polarization in belief, and some of the agents that are performing their group's action actually agree with the other group. But because of who they're connected to, they're conforming with their local people, and vice versa. Do these outcomes make sense? Here's a picture of the second kind of outcome. Right, so this is a scenario where all of the agents are performing action B, but these two secretly think A is better. Similarly, here's one where they're all performing action A, but these two secretly believe B is better. These can be stable outcomes depending on what the beta distribution parameters are. Okay, so just as an initial observation, conformity tends to reduce consensus. So here's, as the conformity parameter increases, these are all still relatively small values. I don't remember exactly what parameters these are. I think it's a size 10 network. But it's qualitatively the same across all of the parameters that you can vary. What happens is, as the conformity increases, is that the fraction of correct consensus, by correct consensus I mean everyone believes action B is better and everyone performs action B, that number decreases. What increases is correct disagreement, where everyone performs action B, but some believe that A is better, right? And so you can end up in this situation where, as K increases, I can get you to change your behavior more quickly than I can get you to change your mind. And eventually, everyone's just performing action B. And if you're an agent who, because of your initial beliefs, happen to think that A had a high likelihood, you never get enough evidence of A to show you that actually is worse than B. Once everyone's performing action B, you're never going to change your mind about that. Okay. There's this other possibility, incorrect consensus. That's just where everyone is performing action A and everyone thinks action A is better. You know, that's the alternative for no conformity. That remains a pretty consistent slither. Slither? That's not the right word. Sliver. A consistent sliver as conformity increases. And then this other possibility of polarization increases as K increases. No, sorry. In this particular model, you aren't getting polarization. I just misread it. This is incorrect disagreement. I'll tell you how conformity, how polarization happens in this model in a moment. Okay. Now, there are circumstances where conformity matters more or less. So one thing that we find in this model is that conformity is very important for hard problems. In cases where it's difficult to tell the difference between the two arms, you need more evidence to change your mind. This is for a fixed conformity parameter. You end up having less consensus, less correct consensus. Correct disagreement ends up being more or less constant, but then this incorrect consensus is more, and then as the success rate of the better belief, that's that little e, right? So the difference between action B and action A in terms of expected value, as that increases, the number of cases of incorrect consensus decreases. And so you end up being able to convince people more quickly. Now, there are two ways of interpreting this. One way of interpreting this is that conformity is really important in the case where it's sort of hard to get evidence. There's another way of interpreting, though, where what's going on here is that in the case where it doesn't really matter which arm you pull, in the sense that the probability of success is, the difference in probability of success is very small between them. And so your expected payoff of pulling the wrong arm is very close to your expected payoff of pulling the right arm. Under those circumstances, your other preferences can come to swamp your preference to maximize your outcome. And so there, you might just not care that much, right, in this scenario. You might just not care that much that you're not absolutely maximizing your payoff from the arms, because that payoff doesn't, I mean, just the number is very small. The difference is very small. What you care about more is maximizing your conformity payoff. But as it matters more which one you choose for fixed conformity parameter, you end up caring more about getting the right answer. Now, when Caitlin and I wrote The Misinformation Age, we put a lot of weight on this kind of result, and we argued that a lot of the things that drive false belief turn on the fact that there's not a lot of immediate consequence for the people who are conforming, employing kind of bad heuristics for what to trust, or doing other things that involve sort of having bad epistemic hygiene. What we argued was that in a case where it really mattered, where it was like, life or death, or where, maybe your children were going to die, or you were going to die, or your parents were going to die, you would pay much closer attention, right? You'd be in this kind of scenario where it would matter to get it right, and that these other kinds of social effects would matter more. We may even have said something like, if you imagine a scenario where there was a global pandemic, people would really care about getting the facts right. Turned out that was wrong, I would say, or at least the conditions under which you end up in this sort of scenario depend much more on immediacy of outcome and perhaps even severity, and also that the social factors are really, really strong. The other sorts of things that contribute to your behavior and so on are very strong. What's interesting is that I think, at least in the US, we did see a fairly significant number of people in this sort of scenario. Because of their political beliefs, they would say certain things about COVID, but privately, they might express other views, or alternatively, privately, they might take other actions. And so there was a big scandal, for instance, in the US, where people on the political right tended to be very skeptical of the COVID vaccine. And so there was lots of news reporting about the dangers of the vaccine and arguing that it wasn't effective or that you shouldn't do it. But then it turned out that a number of prominent media personalities had all been vaccinated. And so they were saying one thing on TV because that's what they thought the people who were listening to them wanted to hear. But in their private lives, when they were making their own decisions, they actually believed the opposite thing and were acting in a different kind of way. And so, yeah, exactly how to think about this result, I think, turns out to be kind of subtle, and it's not as straightforward as we thought it was 5 years ago. Okay, polarization in science. One of the things that makes this particular model very interesting is the way in which network effects end up interacting with the conformity dynamics. It turns out that what kinds of outcomes you get are highly sensitive to network structure. And in particular, polarization can arise in this model, but only under very special circumstances. It only happens when the networks have certain structural features. And now we're talking specifically about polarization in action. Right? Polarization in belief can happen under any circumstances in this model. But polarization in action can only happen under certain circumstances where you have these structural features, where agents performing a given action generally do not have. Oh, I'm sorry. What I mean here is we're talking about polarization in action where we aren't necessarily assuming that agents performing a given action have the same beliefs. Okay, when can polarization in action happen here? Remember from the very first presentation, I described some of the network structures that we would look at. We've spent a lot of time talking about the cycle, the complete network, a little bit of time talking about the wheel. I'm now going to talk about these ones down here. We're going to look at random networks, and in particular, we're going to look at random networks that have cliques. C-L-I-C? Q-U-E? No C? Okay. C-L-I-Q-U-E. These are the ones here that are labeled as clumpy, and what these are networks where you have agents that are tightly connected to one another, multiple groups of agents that are tightly connected to one another, but connections between the groups are weak. So what happens in this model is that polarization can arise in these sorts of networks with clique structures, because what ends up happening is that the bridges between the cliques are the only way in which information can propagate between the networks. And so here's a situation where this clique is all performing action B, and they all believe action B is better. Over here, everyone is performing action A, right? That's why they all have white nodes. Now, there's only one agent at the border between them. That agent gets evidence from this one, and over time, comparing the evidence with this one, the evidence from the other ones, is able to form accurate beliefs. So this agent comes to see that B is in fact better. But because they're connected to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 agents performing action A, and only one agent performing action B, they never switch. And because they never switch, none of this evidence that they're getting ends up getting generated in a way that anyone in this clique can see it. And so none of the other agents are ever able to get that information. None of them change their minds, and this ends up being a stably polarized situation. Right? And it's just this bridge, is kind of this information bottleneck that's causing the result. It has nothing to do with trust. It's just the regular updating rule. Yeah. Yeah, so we're using the sophisticated belief structure here, where you have a distribution for each of your arms. And so what's going on here is this agent in each round gets a whole bunch of evidence about arm A, and very quickly comes to be confident about what the correct probability for arm A is. And in addition, they're getting information about arm B. They're getting less information about it, but that information is just updating their beta distribution about arm B. And in the long run, they end up in a situation where they have enough evidence about both arms to be narrowly peaked around the correct probabilities. And so they know that arm B is better. They have very little uncertainty about it, in fact. But they never change their action, so they never start sharing evidence about arm B, and none of these other agents ever update. Yeah. But they're not competing with one another, right? Because you have two different distributions. You're just updating both distributions according to the evidence that's relevant to that distribution. Yeah, it does. Yeah, so this sort of thing it comes about typically in a case where this group prematurely converges to A, this group prematurely converges to B, and then these two are exchanging evidence. So this one's getting evidence about A, and this one's getting evidence about B. But then in the long run, this one will get enough evidence from just that one agent to become convinced that B is better. And so you can see the dependence on network structure here. So we look at different kinds of networks. In the clumpy network, polarization happens about 40% of the time. When I say clumpy here, I literally mean this, right? I'll talk about other clique structures in a minute. Polarization happens about 40% of the time. Correct consensus ends up being very rare. Correct disagreement and incorrect disagreement. These scenarios where you have agents that are acting one way but believe something else, those two things happen much more often. And so what ends up happening in the clumpy network is that you get generally very bad outcomes. Although, maybe 30% of the time, everyone's performing the correct action. In complete networks, you never get polarization. In complete networks, you get correct consensus and correct disagreement. More than half the time, everyone's performing the right action. Incorrect consensus happens sometimes, and then you just get some fraction of outcomes where everyone believes it is performing the wrong action. Some people might believe that the better action is better, but they're all performing the wrong action. The cycle, consistent with the results I showed on Monday, the cycle does better than the complete network. About half the time, it gets a correct consensus. Another 40% of the time, approximately, it gets the correct disagreement. So everyone's performing the right action. And then sometimes you'll get incorrect consensus. The wheel looks a bit more like the complete network in this case. Now, random networks, we looked at this because we wanted to see, all of these are very special from the point of view of networks of a given size. Yeah, Kartiki. So polarization is polarization in action. All of the rest of them are consensus in action, correct or incorrect, but sometimes you have consensus in action and disagreement in belief. No. So correct disagreement means correct action, but you disagree in your beliefs. And similarly, incorrect disagreement means incorrect action and disagreement on your beliefs. And so we wanted to see, if you look at sort of the space of all possible networks, how likely are each of these sorts of outcomes? And it turns out that if you look at random networks, it looks a lot more like complete networks than anything else. But in some fraction of cases, you end up with the behavior of the clumpy network. Now, when we say random here, there are a number of standard algorithms for constructing random networks. But what you're doing is you're looking at all possible networks. We're looking, in fact, at all possible connected networks. You look at all possible connected networks with just a uniform probability distribution over them. And so, there's one possible connected network of 2 agents. There are however many of 3 agents, and so on. It's always some finite number. You just assign equal probability to all of them. You sample from those randomly. You run the simulation. Sample another one, run the simulation. Sample another one, run the simulation. You do this, a few tens of thousands of times. You get a sense of what the statistics are. This is what we find. It turns out, though, that not all networks are equally likely when you're looking at human social networks. I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. Human social networks tend to have a special character. They tend to be small world networks. So small world networks are networks with high clustering and low average path length. That means is that they look more like the clumpy networks than they look like complete or cycle networks or other networks. What this means is that you tend to get clicks. You tend to get agents who are tightly connected to one another, even though there's typically a relatively short path between individual agents. But those paths are going to tend to run through particularly well-connected agents. So this is the idea behind 6 degrees of separation, that you can get from one person to another in 6 degrees. It's like six steps, even though most people don't know most people in the world. Okay, so a little bit more precisely, clustering here measures the probability that if 2 agents share a neighbor, they're also connected to one another. So if I'm friends with Sylvia and Kaylin's friends with Sylvia, there's a good chance that Kaylin and I know each other. So high clustering increases that probability. Average path length is just what it sounds like. It's the average length of the shortest path between any 2 nodes. Okay, and so as an empirical matter of fact, if you look at actual human social networks, we find these parameters are within this small world class. And so just one really striking example, Facebook actually did an analysis of their users in 2016. They had over 1 billion people, representing at that point something like 1/6 of the world population. The average path length in their network is 3.6, I believe, less than 4. Any 2 agents, any 2 humans, people on Facebook, on average, were connected by fewer than 4 connections. Now, as Facebook has grown, apparently this has grown as well. It's now over 4, but it's still less than 6. Okay. And so, the clumpy network is the perfect example of a small world network, because the average path length between agents there is less than 4, but of course it has a high clustering coefficient. Okay, so how do we study these things? We want to have a sense of all small, we want to look at all small world networks, but these are, there aren't sort of firm numbers that tell you, oh yes, this network, because of its clustering coefficient and its average path length, definitely is small world and this one isn't. The way that people do this is they use an algorithm that tends to produce networks with these characteristics. There are 2 parameters that go into this algorithm that tend to play with the clustering and average path length, but which don't uniquely determine what those values are going to end up being. And so if you want to do sort of a statistical test, like sampling from different possible small world networks with a little bit of noise, a little bit of variation, you use this algorithm, you generate small world networks, and then you test things on those networks due to Strogatz and Watts. And the way it works is you have these 2 parameters, k and b. You begin with a regular ring lattice of degree k. So this is like the cycle, except you're not just connected to your neighbors, you're also connected to your neighbor's neighbors, your neighbor's neighbor's neighbors, and so on, up to k/2, so that you have k connections on average. Not on average, in fact, it's a regular ring lattice, so everyone has k connections. For each node, and you take this regular ring lattice, and then you sort of sequentially, you take each node, you look at just their rightward-facing neighbors. With probability b for each of these edges, you rewire it. So you take that edge, probability b less than 1, of course. You say, well, I'm going to now connect to a different agent. You avoid duplications. You avoid loops. So you're not connected. You're not going to rewire to yourself, and you're not going to rewire to someone you're already connected to. And so what you see here is that the average degree remains fixed in this. You're not losing any connections, you're just changing the connections. But depending on what B is, you're going to end up having more or less of these rewirings that connect up cliques. Okay. So B ends up estimating the path length. So here's just an example of how this works. Here's a regular lattice of degree 2. Here's a random rewiring. This node, nothing happened. This node, one of the connections got rewired. This node, nothing happened. This node, nothing happened. Sorry, in fact, this is, I just tried to be random doing this, but there's no way in which you could get this outcome. One of these would have to go away, and this one would have to be back. It doesn't matter, though. This one, something illegal happened. This one, nothing happened. This one should still be connected because there's no way to have that one get rewired in that way. Okay, and so on, going around. Polarization in small world networks. What we see here is that for different values of this parameter B and different degree, you get different values of polarization. But for low average degree, in all of these different values of B, you tend to have around half polarized outcomes, similar to the clumpy network. As degree increases, it depends on what B is. As degree increases, if B becomes high, you end up looking more and more like a complete network or like a generic non-small world network. For low B, though, for high degree, you still end up with a significant number of polarized outcomes. And so what we're seeing here is that although polarization is rare from the point of view of all possible networks, once you start paying attention just to small world networks, where you have these sort of realistic features of human networks, polarization ends up being very common. I believe that it's, we only did these for 50 agent networks. I think we also looked at 100 agent networks, but they took a really long time to run. Smaller than 50, though, we found that there just weren't enough agents in the network for these parameters to discriminate different possibilities. You sort of ended up in this regime very quickly. Okay, so the takeaway is that conformity plus certain network structures provides another sufficient cause of polarization. Now it has nothing to do with trust, but it's because you get these bottlenecks where people are conforming and therefore failing to pass along their own best information to others. Since realistic social networks appear to have cliques, they are small world networks, conformity may even explain some real world polarization. Okay, I have 7 minutes left, and I'm going to use it to do a little bit of philosophy. I think that there will still be time for a general question period afterwards. So what are we supposed to make of this situation? I've given you two models that both yield polarization, but do it in very different ways. It's tempting, under these circumstances, to say that if a model reproduces some qualitative phenomenon, we take that fact as evidence that some feature of the model is descriptively accurate. Right? This looks like the kind of inferential pattern we use all the time, where we say, I have some evidence, I have a theory, the theory explains the evidence, that should increase the probability that the theory is true. On the other hand, in a situation like this, where it looks like you can have multiple models that give the same result, you might want to say, well, hold on a second, under those circumstances, I don't learn anything because I don't know which one could be right. Both of them are compatible with the evidence. This is sometimes described as a kind of underdetermination of theory by evidence problem, where there's not enough evidence to tell the difference between two different possible theoretical explanations of some phenomenon. And so you might conclude that in order to understand real-world polarization, Further, more fine-grained empirical evidence is needed. We need to distinguish between these models to see which one is right, which one gives the better explanation, which one is more consistent with the evidence. Now, I think in many cases in science, this is exactly the kind of conclusion that you would want to draw, that if you have two competing theories, they both explain the evidence equally well, what you need is new and better evidence. Now, I don't want to say that we don't want new and better evidence about how polarization arises in real human communities. We absolutely do. It's really important work that's getting done right now, analyzing, in particular, online social networks, social media, to understand how polarization happens. It's difficult to do because most of the data is proprietary, and Facebook and X and many other social media platforms, Instagram, so on, tend to be very reluctant to share that data with researchers. And so some researchers have access, many don't. They have limited access. When they do have access, it's not a great situation. But still, it's an important project and something to look at. Even so, I want to suggest that in this case, in cases like this, where you're looking at modeling social phenomena, it's the wrong way of thinking. The reason it's the wrong way of thinking is that it takes for granted the idea that these explanations of the phenomenon are incompatible with one another, that only one of them could be right. Now, if you're thinking about like Newtonian gravitation versus general relativity, that is the right picture to have. Thinking about this, though, it's entirely plausible, I want to claim, that there could be multiple mechanisms that are present in real human societies, all of which contribute to polarization. It can be that I don't trust everyone, and that affects how I update my beliefs. It can also be that I like to conform, and that affects my behavior. And I can put those two things together, and both of them can lead to polarization. In fact, can contribute to the ways in which I am polarized. So I want to suggest that we think about this in a different way and think, look, there are multiple sufficient causes for polarization, and all of them may be operative. I've just described two. Presumably there are others that you can come up with. And so evidence that one is present does not imply that the others are not. Right? And this is really important if we're thinking about how to assess new fine-grained empirical evidence coming from especially big data approaches to analyzing social networks. We don't want to infer that because there's evidence that conformity is important, or there's evidence that trust is important, that it follows that the other one is not, or that the other one is not also present. Because they're simply not inconsistent. Okay, now from a policy point of view, this is very important. Because it turns out that if there are multiple mutually compatible and independently sufficient possible causes for polarization, then the kinds of interventions you might try to dream up to target one could backfire if the others are also present. So just to give an example, suppose that you believe that the problem is conformity, that people are conforming and therefore you're getting these bottlenecks in these small world networks. There's an easy solution. Change the network structure. And you see people suggesting this kind of thing. You see people say, look, the problem with our society is that people end up in these echo chambers. They aren't exposed to enough evidence from people who disagree with them. If we could force more interactions among people who disagree with one another, change people's media diet so that they end up seeing news from sources that don't already agree with them, so that they start seeing social media posts from people who don't already agree with them, that is going to resolve the problem. Now, that might resolve the problem if it's just these network effects with conformity. But if the problem is trust dynamics, it's either not going to make any difference, or even worse, if you have anti-updating, it's going to push people further apart. If it's trust dynamics, you have to be very, very careful about who you're putting in touch. Because if people are sort of extreme in their beliefs, they're going to only become more extreme, right? From the trust dynamics point of view, what you would presumably want to do is find agents that are close enough to the agent who you're trying to influence that they'll pay attention to them, but not so close that they're not sharing reliable information. Then you try to bring people along. And you see that kind of proposal happening as well. You see, at least in the US context, these arguments that centrists play an especially important role, right? That you can have someone who's politically aligned with someone else, but has more moderate views, and that person is going to be more influential. But then if it's conformity that matters, having individuals play that role isn't going to be successful because one person isn't going to be enough to get you to break out of your immediate social bubble. Okay. Okay, so I think the important thing here is that empirical work is needed. What we need is to better understand the relative importance of different causal factors, all of which might be present at once, and also try to understand the ways in which interventions can coordinate between different possible explanations in a way that can improve the situation without exacerbating it due to the presence of other mechanisms. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I was wondering, did you try to run your model on a network that has been measured?
Yeah, so we haven't done that, in part because of the sizes involved. People do study these networks for realistic social media sites, but you're talking about millions of agents, and the kind of dynamics that we're doing and the kind of computational resources that we have don't allow us to do that. It doesn't mean it's impossible, and certainly would be very interesting to do. In fact, we actually we had an NSF grant that supported a bunch of this work, and one of the things that we did was get access to a high-performance computing cluster where I think we would be able to do that. But by the time we got there, we had moved on to other projects and didn't do it. But I agree that it would be interesting to do.
You had that plot with the conformity on the x-axis.
Which one?
The plot where conformity was on the x-axis.
This one.
So is there any reason why you started with such a small order of conformity?
Yeah, because we wanted to see what happens when you're comparing to the baseline of. I mean, we actually begin with conformity equals 0 here, and so we're looking at what happens as conformity increases from the baseline model.
So if I increase conformity further, what will happen? What will
If you increase it beyond 0.01, yeah, I mean, so just think about the expected value calculation, right? So we're doing this for a network of a fixed size. This is a number that we're multiplying the number of agents who are doing something minus the number of agents that aren't doing it. And so what that means is that this number doesn't really scale across different network sizes or different numbers of neighbors. If you have like 100 neighbors, then a conformity of 0.01 is going to mean that conforming with everyone is, always better than, or let me put that differently. Conforming with all of your neighbors is going to greatly swamp the benefits of performing the right action. It's always going to be the case that it swamps it. And it's going to swamp it just because the benefit of conforming is going to be 0.01 times 100. They're all doing the same thing, whereas the benefits of performing the right action is going to be the probability of performing the right action, which is some number less than 1. Exactly, exactly. And so there's another version of the model that you can consider where you either scale by network size or you scale by number of neighbors. And so we actually looked at, the one where you scale by number of neighbors is interesting because if you have a small world network, there's a lot of heterogeneity, well, let me put that differently. There can be, for certain parameters, there can be heterogeneity in how many neighbors you have. And so it can be that some agents are much more susceptible to conformity, but also those are the ones that are going to end up being the bridges in most cases. And so we thought, what if we reduce conformity for those in order to make it that conformity played the same relative role for every agent in a network, even where you had heterogeneity in number of connections. We didn't get substantially different results, and we also kind of decided that that's not how life works, right? I mean, the idea is that you have some preference for conformity, and then you make friends. Making more friends doesn't make you less likely to conform. To the contrary, the least conformist people you know very often don't have very many friends because they're kind of a pain, right? So we decided to stick with this version of the model, but we did look at the other one, and we didn't see significantly different effects. I mean, quantitatively different, but not in ways that change the interpretation of the model.
So can you just say in a nutshell, how did you simulate it?
How do you simulate it?
Yeah.
So you come up with a representation of the network. Each agent is, you have a data structure that represents each agent. Their beta distribution is represented as the two parameters A and B for each arm. So each agent, their state is represented by a list of 4 numbers. And then in each round, each agent performs that expected value calculation based on their 4 parameters and what happened to their neighbors in the previous round. They perform an action, which is just a draw from a binomial distribution. You just randomly go through the network and do that for every agent to avoid ordering effects. I guess actually there aren't ordering effects, it doesn't matter. So maybe we just go through sequentially, I don't know. You get the data, and then everyone updates, and then you just repeat. No, every agent has the same conformity parameter. If you have different conformity parameters for different agents, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, so someone asked me earlier on, so what I was thinking I would do is compile references from all the talks and send them to you to distribute. Yeah, I guess I would say that the right way of thinking about it is that individuals tend to have a tendency to be mistrustful and tend to have a tendency to conform, and they're not just alternating between them. These might vary over time. They could vary with all sorts of different things, age, education, exposure to previous episodes, and so on. But I would tend to think that if you were going to combine these as models, what I would want to do, and we don't do this because I have no way of you're going to get nonlinear effects, and I have no way of measuring the relative contribution of polarization due to trust and polarization due to conformity. But if I were going to combine them, I would just have a modified expected value calculation and a modified updating rule. And each agent would do the thing that they think is going to give them the best outcome. They're then going to evaluate everything, and then they're going to update. Now, I'll note that that's actually, there's a sense in which putting these two models together is actually incoherent, because in the polarization model, you're assuming that agents can see other agents' beliefs and can use that to calculate distance. But in the conformity model, if you could see other agents' beliefs, you wouldn't have the same effect. You know, if you knew that all of your friends believed the other thing. Yeah, you just know about their actions, yeah. So some thought would have to be given to how to conceptually combine them.
Yeah, would it also be interesting to, simulate an intervention in some sense where you deliberately try to rewire a node and see whether that actually eliminates polarization or not?
Yeah, you could do that. That would be interesting to do if you could solve the problem of how to make them consistent with one another conceptually, and also solve the problem of how to think about, you know, k as an arbitrary parameter, and we're thinking what happens as k gets bigger. M is an arbitrary parameter. We're asking what happens when m gets bigger. What does the ratio of m to k mean? I have no idea. Like those, but so you're going to get some trade-off, and in different interventions are going to depend on that trade-off between m and k. And yeah, so I mean, so you might be able to get interesting qualitative information about how these two effects interact with one another. But what you aren't going to get is, I don't think, anything like this intervention is good because we know in the real world k is 0.02 and m is 1.6. That doesn't mean anything at all.
Hi, thanks a lot again. Exactly on that last point, I was wondering, I mean, from these real world networks or empirical networks, actually hard to simulate, and that's a different question, but having access to them, would it be actually possible to then estimate these free parameters?
Yeah, so that's again a really interesting thing to do, and Caitlin and I have both talked to different groups who have this data about ways in which you might do it, and we haven't figured out how yet. But it is the kind of thing that you could certainly ask, right? So for instance, if you have, I mean, what you would need to do, I mean, so here's one way in which you might try, right? You might say something like, suppose I have a small world network with certain clustering coefficients, certain average path length. I expect there to be a characteristic number of clicks associated with network size and those parameters. And then I would expect, if the network is large enough and I have enough clicks, that there would be some distribution of outcomes corresponding to where that distribution is going to depend on the conformity factor. Right? If conformity is low, you might expect almost all of them to agree with one another. If conformity is high, you might end up with more of them disagreeing. The problem is that people aren't trying to solve a multi-arm bandit problem. And so what's the statistics for trying to decide whether or not ivermectin is an effective treatment for a virus? I don't know, right? And so trying to infer from actual rates of polarization without having control over the behavior of the underlying problem makes it very difficult. But that's the kind of thing you would try to do. You try to look for these large-scale statistical effects that are correlated with the parameters in the model, and then try to infer from actual distributions in real-world networks what the parameter would be.
Okay, so thanks, Jim, for a really stimulating set of lectures.
Thanks.